I remember the exact moment I stopped being the kind of woman who believed in fairy tales. It wasn't some grand cinematic explosion. It wasn't a screaming match in the rain or catching him with someone else in our bed. It was a Tuesday, a completely unremarkable, humid Tuesday in mid-September, and I was standing in our kitchen in our Westchester townhouse, staring at a half-empty carton of oat milk, trying to decide if it was still good. That was the day. Not a dramatic climax, but a slow, creeping quiet that had been building for months, maybe years, and I had finally started to notice the silence. My name is Ella, and I was the woman who had it all. That's what everyone said anyway. My husband, Daniel, was a partner at a corporate law firm in the city, the kind of job that came with a corner office and a six-figure bonus that could pay for a small car. We had the townhouse with the original crown molding, the weekend escape to a lake house in the Poconos, the golden retriever named Gus, who was more photogenic than most people I knew. We were that couple, the one at the dinner parties who still held hands under the table, the ones who posted tasteful, unpretentious photos on Instagram of our farm-to-table brunches and our perfectly curated bookshelves. We were a brand, and I was the CEO of our image. But that Tuesday, as I stood there in my Lululemon leggings and a cashmere sweater I'd bought on a whim I couldn't even remember, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Daniel had left for the city at 6 a.m., a blur of expensive cologne and the sound of his Audi pulling out of the driveway. He'd kissed my forehead, a brief, paternal peck that felt more like a formality than a gesture of love. It was the same kiss he gave me when he was half asleep, or when he was already mentally drafting an email in his head. We hadn't had a real conversation in weeks, not the kind that felt like two people connecting anyway. We talked logistics, who was picking up the dry cleaning, if the contractor had called about the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, which weekend we were supposed to have dinner with his parents. I'd given up my career as a graphic designer a few years into our marriage. It was a gradual thing, not a conscious decision. Daniel's career was the rocket ship, and mine was the slow-moving car. It made sense for me to manage the home, to be the one who was available for the contractors, the dog walkers, the social calendar. It was the unspoken deal we'd made. He provided the life, and I made it beautiful. The problem was, I'd become so good at making everything look beautiful that I'd forgotten how to feel anything real. So that Tuesday, I did something I rarely did. I left the pristine quiet of our townhouse and went for a drive. I didn't have a destination. I just wanted to feel something other than the sterile hum of the air conditioning. I ended up at a coffee shop down in the village, a place I'd never been before. It was the kind of place with mismatched furniture, exposed brick, and the smell of old paper and fresh espresso. It was the opposite of the clean, minimalist aesthetic I curated at home. It felt alive. I ordered a lavender latte and took a seat by the window, watching the city pulse with a rhythm I'd long since stopped tapping my foot to. That's where I saw him. He was a man in his late 30s, maybe a few years older than me. He was wearing a paint-stained Henley and jeans, and he was sketching in a thick moleskin notebook with a charcoal pencil. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking out the same window I was, but he was seeing something else entirely. He was capturing it, translating the chaos outside into lines and shadows on a page. He had a steadiness to him, a deep, unbothered focus that was so utterly captivating because it was so utterly alien to me. My world was about controlled chaos. His seemed to be about channeling it. I was so busy watching him that I didn't notice the time. My phone buzzed, shattering the spell. It was a text from Daniel. "Running late. Don't wait up for dinner. Order something nice." That was it. No question about my day. No, how are you? Just an instruction for my solo evening. A sharp, familiar pang of loneliness hit me in the chest, right where my heart used to live. I'd been feeling it for so long that it had become like a background noise I'd learned to tune out. But in that moment, in that chaotic, beautiful coffee shop, it was deafening. I glanced back at the man, and this time our eyes met. It wasn't a flirtatious glance or anything that overt. It was just a look of recognition, a simple human moment of acknowledging another person's presence. It was the kind of look you give someone when you both witness something absurd or beautiful, and you share that fleeting connection without saying a word. I felt a blush creep up my neck, a physical reaction I hadn't felt in years. I looked away, flustered, and gathered my things. I paid and walked out, the bell on the door chiming behind me. I walked home through the streets of the village, the sun beginning its lazy descent, casting long, golden shadows. I felt restless, like a caged animal. The quiet of the townhouse felt like a tomb, but the energy of the city felt too big, too much for me to handle alone. I got in my car and drove home, the GPS guiding me back to my beautiful, empty prison. When I got home, Gus was waiting at the door, his tail wagging a frantic rhythm against the foyer table. I took him for a walk, our usual route around the cul-de-sac, past the perfectly manicured lawns and the houses that all looked like they were pulled from the same catalog. I waved at a neighbor, a woman named Sarah who was always gardening, and I remember thinking how she looked like a painting, a permanent fixture in her flower beds. We exchanged pleasantries about the weather, about how the hydrangeas were doing. It was a nothing conversation, the kind that is the bedrock of suburban life. It was the kind of conversation I was having with my own husband. That night, I made myself a simple dinner, a salmon fillet and some roasted vegetables, and I ate it in front of the TV. I scrolled through Netflix for 20 minutes, unable to find anything that didn't feel like a hollow distraction. Daniel texted at 9 p.m. Just leaving the office, home in an hour. I thought about being excited. I tried to conjure up the feeling of wanting to see him, of wanting to hear about his day, but I couldn't. I was just tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical effort and everything to do with a spiritual void. When he walked in the door at 10:15, I was already in bed, reading a book I'd been on the same page of for an hour. He came in, loosening his tie, looking handsome in that tired, practiced way of his. He leaned down and gave me another one of those kisses, the kind that brushes my hair more than my skin. "Long day," he said, his voice flat. "Me too?" I lied. He went into the bathroom, and I heard the sound of the shower turning on. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the water run. I was living a life that looked perfect on paper, a life I had worked so hard to build, and I was more miserable and invisible than I had ever been in my entire life. I was a ghost in $1 million home. I was the woman who had everything and felt absolutely nothing. Daniel never asked me about the coffee shop. He never asked me about the man with the charcoal pencil. He didn't even ask me what I did that day, besides a vague, "How was your day?" tossed over his shoulder as he hung up his suit jacket. And I gave him the same vague non-answer I always gave. "Fine. Quiet." That word, quiet, was a lie. Everything was quiet, but the silence was just a mask, because underneath it, a storm was starting to brew. I just didn't know it yet. I didn't know that the sight of a stranger sketching in a coffee shop had cracked open a door in my chest that I thought was locked, sealed, and forgotten. I didn't know that in just a few short weeks, that quiet would be shattered, and the noise that would take its place would be so loud, so messy, so raw, that it would change the entire course of my life. And it all started because that Tuesday, I didn't feel invisible for just a fleeting, beautiful moment. I felt seen. And once you feel that, you can't unfeel it. The lonely quiet of my beautiful life started to feel unbearable, a pressure building in the walls of my perfect home. I felt a deep, frantic need to fill it with something, anything that felt real. But I had no idea just how recklessly I was about to do it. I just knew, lying there next to my husband in our king-sized bed, that something had to give, and I was terrified of what it might be. The weeks that followed that Tuesday were like walking through a dream where everything is slightly off, slightly tilted. I started finding excuses to go into the city, to that village. I told myself it was for the energy, for the inspiration I needed to start sketching again, to pick up a hobby that wasn't just managing my husband's life. I told myself it was to find myself, this woman I used to be before I became Daniel's wife. But lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling while Daniel snorts softly beside me, I knew the truth was sharper and more pathetic than that. I was going back for the stranger, for the ghost of a moment that had made me feel like a real person for the first time in years. I became a creature of routine, a secret one. Every Tuesday and Thursday, after Daniel left for the city, I would get in my car and drive the 45 minutes to that coffee shop. I'd order my lavender latte and sit by the same window, a book or my neglected sketchbook open in front of me, my eyes always scanning the room. I felt like a teenager, idiotic and hopeful, stalking a crush. It was humiliating, and I couldn't stop myself. The first few times, I didn't see him. I told myself it was for the best, that it was a sign from the universe to stop this ridiculous fantasy before it went anywhere. I'd go home feeling relieved and disappointed in equal measure, the familiar silence of my townhouse swallowing me whole. But on the fourth Thursday, he was there. He was in the same spot, working on what looked like a different sketch, this one of the old fire escape outside the window. My heart did a stupid, traitorous flip in my chest, a physical lurch that felt like a teenage crush and a midlife crisis all rolled into one. I fumbled with my coffee cup and sat down at my usual table, trying to look cool and collected, trying to act like I hadn't been thinking about him for the past 2 weeks. I didn't know his name. I didn't know anything about him, and I was already constructing a fantasy around him, a life where he was kind and sensitive and saw me, really saw me for who I was. This time he looked up and smiled. It was a small, easy smile, the kind that creased the corners of his eyes. "You're back," he said. His voice was warm, a little rough, like he'd been drinking coffee all day. My face flushed. "I'm a creature of habit," I said, my voice coming out breathier than I intended. I hated myself for it. I was a grown woman, not a nervous teenager. "Me too," he said. He gestured with his charcoal pencil towards the window. "I've been sketching this fire escape for a week. I can't seem to get the perspective right." I looked at his sketchbook, at the intricate, beautiful lines he'd drawn. He was talented, really talented. "It's incredible," I said, and I meant it. "You've captured the rust on the metal, the way the light hits the bricks. It's alive." He looked surprised, then genuinely pleased. "You see that?" he asked, his voice curious. "I used to be an artist," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "A graphic designer mostly. But I stopped." "Why?" It was such a simple question, but it felt like a punch to the gut. Why had I stopped? Why had I let the most creative, alive part of myself wither away in the quiet suburbs? I didn't have an answer that didn't sound like a cop-out, like blaming my husband for my own choices. So I just shrugged. "Life got in the way," I said. He nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "I get that. My name's Leo, by the way." "Ella," I said, and for the first time in a long time, my name didn't feel like a label, a wife of the partner label. It felt like me. From that day on, our meetings became a regular thing. I'd sit at my table, he'd sit at his, and we'd talk. We talked about art, about the city, about books and music and everything that Daniel never wanted to talk about. Leo was a freelance illustrator, a man who'd spent his 20s traveling through Europe and South America, scraping by on commissions and couch surfing, living a life of vibrant, chaotic freedom. He had no 401k, no retirement plan, no health insurance that wasn't catastrophic. He was everything my husband wasn't, and he was exhilarating. With Leo, I wasn't Ella, the perfect wife. I was Ella, the woman who made a mean cup of coffee and could see the poetry in a rusty fire escape. He laughed at my jokes, the sarcastic ones I'd been saving up for years. He asked me what I thought about things, my real opinions, not the carefully curated ones I presented at dinner parties. I told him about my love for impressionist painters, about the semester I spent in Florence in college, about the graphic novel I'd always wanted to write but never had the courage to start. He listened. He actually listened, his eyes focused on me, making me feel like the most important person in the world. It was intoxicating. It was addictive. And it was a massive, massive betrayal. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was walking a dangerous line. I'd go home and look at Daniel, sleeping in our bed, and a wave of guilt would hit me so hard I'd have to sit down. This was the man I'd promised to love and cherish, the man who'd given me a beautiful life, and I was spending my afternoons in a coffee shop, pouring my soul out to a stranger, craving his attention like oxygen. The guilt was a constant hum in the back of my mind, a soundtrack to my double life. But the loneliness, the desperate, aching loneliness, was louder, so much louder. Daniel, of course, was oblivious. He was so consumed by his work, by the pressures of billable hours and client acquisition that he didn't notice the changes in me. He didn't notice the new glow in my skin, the way I dressed a little nicer on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the secret smile that sometimes played on my lips. He didn't notice I was falling out of love with him because I was falling into something else. Something dangerous and thrilling and completely unhinged. He was the CEO of his own life, and I was just a line item on his to-do list, a box to be checked. Wife, loved. Home, managed. Dog, walked. He didn't see me any more than he saw the fire escapes in the village. I was just part of the background, the beautiful scenery of his successful life. The cracks started to show in the strangest places. One Friday night, Daniel and I were at a charity gala for the arts, a black tie affair at the Museum of Modern Art. I was wearing a navy blue silk dress that I knew made me look stunning. Daniel was working the room, shaking hands with donors and partners, a charming smile plastered on his face. I stood by the bar, nursing a glass of champagne, feeling like a piece of furniture. I looked around the room at all the beautiful, wealthy, hollow people, and I felt a sudden, violent wave of disgust. This was my world. These were my people, and I hated all of them. I excused myself to the restroom, and on the way, I saw a sketch of a woman on display, a charcoal portrait that was startlingly intimate. It reminded me of Leo's work, of the way he saw the world and lines and shadows. I stared at it, my mind drifting to him, to our conversations, to the way he touched my hand when I'd made him laugh. A shiver ran down my spine. "What are you doing?" I whispered to my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My own eyes stared back at me, wide and panicked. "What are you doing, Ella?" I didn't have an answer. I just knew I couldn't stop. The draw was too strong. It was like a gravitational pull. I needed him. I needed to feel seen, needed to feel like I was more than just a pretty accessory in my husband's life. It was a desperate, selfish need, and I was willing to risk everything to satisfy it. I was playing with fire, and I knew I was going to get burned. The next Tuesday, Leo asked me if I wanted to see his studio. He said it was just a block away, a cramped little space above a laundromat, but it was his. It was the place where he made his art. My heart hammered in my chest. I knew what this was. I knew the line I was about to cross. But I said yes anyway, because I couldn't say no. I didn't want to say no. His studio was exactly as he described it, cluttered, chaotic, beautiful. Canvases leaned against every wall, sketches were taped to the windows, the smell of turpentine and paint hung thick in the air. It was the opposite of my sterile, spotless townhouse. It was alive with creativity. He showed me his current project, a series of paintings inspired by the city's forgotten corners. He talked about his process, his frustrations, his dreams. He was so passionate, so raw, so real, and he was looking at me like I was the muse for all of it. The tension between us was palpable, a living, breathing thing in the small, cluttered room. I knew I should leave. I knew I should walk out that door and never come back. I knew it was wrong. But the loneliness was a physical ache, and he was the only thing that made it stop. He stepped closer to me, and I didn't move away. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering on my cheek. "Ella," he said, his voice low and husky. And I kissed him. I kissed him, and I wasn't thinking about Daniel or our perfect house or the life I was blowing up. I was just thinking about how it felt to be wanted, to be desired, to be alive. It was a desperate, hungry kiss, years of loneliness and neglect pouring out of me in a single explosive moment. He pulled back, his eyes searching mine. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Is this what you want?" I nodded because I couldn't speak. The words were stuck in my throat. I wanted it. I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything in my life. I was a woman drowning in a beautiful life, and he was the air I was gasping for. It happened there, in his studio, on the floor amidst the canvases and the paint. It wasn't romantic in a traditional sense. It was messy and urgent and raw. It was the opposite of the quiet, perfectly choreographed intimacy of my marriage. It was real, and it was terrifying, and I felt alive for the first time in a decade. Afterward, we lay on the floor, my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. It was pounding as hard as mine. The guilt was there, lurking in the shadows, but it was drowned out by the pure, selfish pleasure of the moment. I knew I had just done something unforgivable. I knew I was a liar and a cheater and a terrible, terrible person. But in that moment, in the quiet of that chaotic studio, I didn't care. I had been invisible for so long, and now, finally, I was seen. I was seen by him, and it was the most intoxicating feeling in the world. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know how I was going to go back to my perfect life and pretend I hadn't just shattered the most sacred vow I had ever made. I didn't know anything. I just knew that there was no going back. The door had locked behind us, and I had just turned the key. I didn't know what was waiting on the other side, but I knew I was about to find out. The aftermath of that afternoon in Leo's studio was a blur of compartmentalization that would have made a CIA operative jealous. I drove home with the windows down, the autumn air whipping my hair across my face, trying to physically blow the guilt out of my system. I walked into the townhouse, past the foyer table with the fresh flowers I'd bought 3 days ago, and looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. I expected to see a scarlet letter on my chest, some visible mark of my betrayal, but I just saw the same woman, a little flushed, a little wild-eyed, but still recognizable. Still Ella, still the wife, still the fraud. Daniel was home early that night, a rare occurrence. He was in the living room reading a brief on his tablet, a glass of bourbon on the side table. He looked up when I walked in, and for a second I was terrified he could see it all written on my face, but he just smiled that distant, pleasant smile. "Hey, you're back early. How is the city?" "The city," I repeated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "Fine. Boring." I wasn't lying. The city had been boring before Leo. Now it was a minefield of memories and longing. I just did some shopping, picked up a few things. He nodded, already looking back at his tablet. "I ordered in. Thai, your favorite. It's in the kitchen." I stood there for a moment watching him. This man I had promised to love. This man I had just betrayed in the most intimate way possible. And he was bringing me my favorite Thai food. The guilt was a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him to look at me, to really look at me, to see that something had fundamentally shifted, that his wife was no longer the woman he thought she was. But I couldn't. I just thanked him quietly and went into the kitchen, the smell of pad thai making my stomach churn with nausea. That night when we were in bed, I lay next to him, staring at the ceiling as usual. But this time, I wasn't thinking about loneliness. I was thinking about Leo, about the way his hands felt on my skin, about the way he breathed my name like a prayer. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. Daniel reached over and put his hand on my stomach, a familiar, comfortable gesture. He started to move closer, his intention clear. It had been months since we'd made love. I'd always been too tired, too distracted, too resentful of his neglect. But tonight, I had no excuses. Tonight, I was the one who was guilty. I panicked. "Not tonight," I said, my voice a little too sharp. "I'm tired." He pulled his hand back, and I heard the faint sigh of disappointment. He turned over, and within minutes, I heard his breathing even out into the steady rhythm of sleep. I lay there, my heart pounding, my skin crawling with a shame that was so deep, it felt like it was in my bones. I was a monster, a selfish, broken, pathetic monster. And I didn't know how to stop being one. But stopping wasn't an option. Because the next morning, when Daniel left for the city, I didn't stay home. I didn't even make it to the coffee shop. I called Leo and told him I was coming over. I couldn't stay away. It was like I was addicted, and he was the only thing that could satisfy the craving. I was spiraling, and I knew it. I could feel myself becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who was willing to risk everything for the fleeting thrill of being desired. That afternoon in his studio, we didn't even pretend to talk first. It was frantic, desperate, like we were both trying to consume each other. And when it was over, I lay on the floor, gasping for air, and I started to cry. Not soft, pretty tears, ugly, gasping sobs that shook my entire body. Leo pulled me into his arms, stroking my hair, murmuring reassurances. Hey, he said softly. What's wrong? Talk to me. I couldn't answer. I was crying for the person I used to be, the woman who had believed in loyalty and honesty and the sanctity of a vow. I was crying for the life I was destroying, the beautiful, perfect life I had spent so long building. I was crying because I knew, with a terrible, absolute certainty, that I wasn't going to stop. I was going to keep doing this. I was going to keep destroying everything. I'm ruining everything, I sobbed. I'm a terrible person. I'm a liar. I'm a cheater. Leo held me tighter, his voice soothing. You're not a terrible person, Ella. You're a person who's been neglected and invisible. You're a person who needed to feel something real. His words were a balm, a justification for my actions. But they didn't erase the guilt. They just buried it deeper, pushing it down into a place I couldn't access unless I was alone in the quiet of my own home. I stayed in his studio until the early evening, avoiding my phone, avoiding the real world. When I finally looked at it, I had 3 texts from Daniel. Dinner? Everything okay? Let me know if you want me to pick something up. He was the perfect husband. He was so utterly, painfully perfect that it made what I was doing even worse. I went home and made a show of being normal. I made him a steak dinner, his favorite, with roasted potatoes and asparagus. We ate in the dining room, the candles flickering, the silverware gleaming. We made small talk. I told him about a new exhibit at the Met that I thought we should see. He talked about a case he was working on, a merger that was getting complicated. It was a perfectly normal, perfectly hollow conversation. And then he dropped a bombshell. So, the firm is sending me to Singapore for a month, he said, cutting his steak with practiced precision. It's a new client, a big deal. They want me there to oversee the initial integration. I leave next week. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. A month? I repeated, the word tasting strange on my tongue. A month. A whole month of freedom. A whole month where I could see Leo whenever I wanted, without the constant fear of getting caught. The thought should have terrified me. It should have filled me with dread. Instead, I felt a surge of relief so palpable it was almost dizzying. Unless they extend it, he shrugged. Could be longer. We'll see how it goes. I put my fork down, trying to look disappointed, trying to conjure up the appropriate wife-like concern. That's a long time, I said, my voice flat. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. You'll be fine. You have Gus, you have your things. He paused. And you have your new friend. The air left my lungs. My new friend. What did he know? Did he know about Leo? Was he testing me?
My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic drumbeat in the silence of the dining room. I could feel the blood draining from my face. What? I managed to choke out. Your new friends in the city, he said, his tone casual, dismissive. You mentioned you were meeting some people for coffee. I'm glad you're doing things for yourself, Ella. It's good. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. He didn't know. He was clueless. He was so utterly, pathetically clueless. He saw me leaving for the city every Tuesday and Thursday, and he assumed I was having coffee with friends, like a normal, well-adjusted wife. He didn't know he was funding his own betrayal, paying for the gas that drove me to another man's arms. The contempt I felt for him in that moment was sharper and more poisonous than the guilt. He didn't even care enough to be suspicious. He was so wrapped up in his own world that he couldn't see the wreckage forming right in front of him. Right, I said, my voice steady, my game face back in place. It's been nice, getting out of the house. He nodded,
pleased with my answer. Good. I'm glad. You deserve to have fun. Fun. That's what he called it. Fun. I was having an affair that was tearing me apart from the inside out, and he called it fun. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. For the rest of the meal, I was on autopilot, my mind racing with possibilities. A month. A whole month without him. It was a dream and a nightmare all at once. The dream was Leo. The nightmare was the fall, because I knew with a sickening clarity that when Daniel left for Singapore, I wasn't going to be discreet. I wasn't going to keep my secret tucked away in the city. I was going to bring it home. And that's exactly what I did. The day Daniel left, I helped him pack his suitcase. I kissed him goodbye at the door, a performance of wifely devotion. I watched his Audi disappear down the street, and the moment it was out of sight, I felt a release of tension so profound I nearly collapsed. I called Leo the second I was back inside. He's gone, I said, my voice breathless. He's gone for a month. Leo was quiet for a moment. Ella, he said, his voice cautious, what does this mean? I knew what he was asking. He was asking if I was going to leave my husband. He was asking if this was going to become something real, something permanent. And I didn't have an answer. I couldn't leave Daniel. He was my safety net, my comfortable prison. But I couldn't give up Leo either. He was the only thing that made me feel alive. It means we can see each other more, I said, deflecting. It means we don't have to hide. He hesitated. Ella, I don't want to be your secret. I want to be a part of your life, the real life, not just the stolen hours. I felt a surge of panic. You are a part of my life, I insisted. You're the most important part. This is just complicated. You know it's complicated. Complicated, he repeated, and there was a bitterness in his voice I'd never heard before. Yeah, I guess it is. That conversation hung in the air between us, a specter of an unresolved future, but I chose to ignore it. I chose to live in the fantasy, to pretend that Daniel was just a complication, a minor obstacle in the path of my true happiness. I started spending nights at Leo's studio. I'd tell my neighbors I was going to the city for an evening event, and I'd drive straight to him. We'd cook together in his tiny kitchen, the smell of garlic and wine filling the cramped space. We'd make love and talk until the early hours of the morning. He started leaving his toothbrush in my bag, a subtle claim on my time. For a few glorious, reckless weeks, I was living a double life, and I was managing it. I was a high-wire artist, juggling guilt and desire, and I thought I was invincible. I thought I could have it all. I thought I could keep the perfect husband and the passionate lover, and that no one would ever get hurt. But the foundation of any perfect house is brittle, and all it takes is one crack to bring the whole thing down. And the crack, as it turned out, was my own stupid, careless pride. It happened on a Saturday. I was at the townhouse, pretending to be a normal suburban wife, when I decided to be bold. Leo had been getting frustrated with the secrecy, pushing me to make a decision. He wanted to meet my friends, to be a part of my life. I was terrified, but I also wanted to prove to him that he was important to me, so I did something monumentally stupid. I invited him to my world. There was a fall festival in our town, a quaint, perfectly picturesque event with hay rides and pumpkin patches and local apple cider. It was the kind of event I always attended with Daniel, the kind that looked great on social media. I told him I wanted to go alone, to just have a quiet day to myself. He didn't question it. He never questioned anything. And then I called Leo and told him to come. I told him to meet me there. I wanted to show him off. I wanted to pretend, just for a day, that he was mine, that we were a normal couple walking through a pumpkin patch. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn day. The leaves were a riot of red and gold. Leo showed up in a worn leather jacket and jeans, looking so utterly out of place among the polo shirts and designer boots that I found it both thrilling and terrifying. We walked around the festival, drinking hot cider, laughing at the corny decorations. He put his arm around me, and for a moment, I let myself pretend. I let myself believe that this was my real life, that this rugged, passionate artist was my partner, and that the beautiful townhouse and the successful husband were just a figment of my imagination. And then I saw her, Sarah, my neighbor, the one who was always gardening. She was there with her husband and their 2 kids. Our eyes met across the crowd, and I saw the flicker of recognition. She smiled and started walking towards me. Leo's arm was still around my shoulder. There was no time to push him away, no time to explain, no time to do anything but stand there, frozen, as the perfect, tidy world I had worked so hard to build came crashing down around me. Sarah's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a micro-expression that I, in my heightened state of panic, caught with the clarity of a hawk. It was the kind of smile that was trying too hard to be normal, the kind that was already busy filing away information for later dissection. She was a good woman, Sarah, the kind who brought casseroles to new neighbors and remembered your birthday. But she was also the kind of woman who ran the neighborhood gossip network, the one who knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. And in that moment, I knew, with a sickening certainty, that my secret was no longer safe. "Ella," she chirped, her voice a little too bright. "I didn't expect to see you here. Daniel said he was traveling." Her eyes flickered to Leo, taking in his scruffy beard, his worn leather jacket, the comfortable way his arm was draped around my shoulder. The question was unspoken, but it was screaming at me from her wide, curious eyes. I stepped forward, a desperate, instinctive move to put some physical distance between me and the evidence of my betrayal. "Sarah, hi," I said, my voice a full octave higher than it should have been. "Yes, Daniel's in Singapore for a few weeks. I'm just enjoying the weather." I gestured vaguely at Leo, my mind racing for a plausible lie. "This is my cousin Leo. He's visiting from California." The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them, and they tasted like ash. Leo's arm, which had been so warm and reassuring just moments before, now felt like an anchor dragging me down. I felt his body tense beside me. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his disappointment radiating off him like a physical heat. Cousin. I had just reduced him to a relative, a convenient, sexless fiction. In a single sentence, I had erased everything we were, everything we'd shared. Sarah smiled widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, how lovely," she said. "A California cousin? How long are you in town for, Leo?" Leo looked at me, his expression unreadable, and then he turned to Sarah. "Long enough," he said, his voice flat. "Ella and I have a lot of catching up to do." The conversation was stilted and painful, a series of pleasantries exchanged over the roaring cacophony of my own internal panic. Sarah talked about her kids' soccer games, about the new fence they were putting in, about a dinner party she was planning for the following weekend. She extended the invitation to me, her eyes flicking to Leo, and I knew it was a test. She wanted to see if I'd bring him. She wanted to confirm what she already suspected. I muttered something about being busy, about Daniel's schedule, anything to end the conversation. After what felt like an eternity, she finally excused herself, her husband and kids trailing behind her. The moment she was out of earshot, Leo pulled his arm away from me. "Your cousin?" he repeated, his voice low and tight. "Is that what I am to you? A convenient lie?" "Leo, I had to say something," I hissed, my own anger rising to meet his. "She's my neighbor. She's friends with Daniel's mother. If she went back and told everyone she saw me with a man who wasn't my husband, my entire life would fall apart." His laugh was short and bitter. "And what do you think she's going to tell them now? That she saw you with your very suspicious, very not coming from California cousin? You think she bought that for a second? You just made it worse, Ella. You made it a mystery. The neighborhood is going to be buzzing by dinner time." He was right. I knew he was right. The lie was flimsy and pathetic, the kind of lie a panicked teenager would tell, not a grown woman who was supposed to be in control of her life. I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet, the precarious foundation of my double life crumbling into dust. I looked around the festival, at the happy families, the laughing children, the couples holding hands, and I felt like an alien, a fraud, an imposter in my own skin. "I have to go home," I said, my voice trembling. "I have to figure this out." Leo grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "No, Ella, you can't just run away every time things get hard. You have to face this. You have to face us. What are we doing? Where is this going?" I pulled my arm away, my eyes stinging with tears of frustration and guilt. "I can't do this right now," I said, shaking my head. "I just can't." And I left him there, standing alone in the middle of the pumpkin patch, surrounded by a sea of strangers. I got in my car and drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, tears blurring my vision. I walked into the townhouse, the silence of it suffocating me. Gus was waiting at the door, his tail wagging, oblivious to the catastrophe that was unfolding. I collapsed on the couch and sobbed. I sobbed for the life I was destroying, for the man I was hurting, for the pathetic, cowardly person I had become. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. I avoided my phone, terrified of what I'd find. Leo called and texted, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I didn't know what to say to him. I didn't know what to say to anyone. I stayed in the townhouse, a prisoner of my own making, jumping at every sound, flinching at every passing car. Sarah, of course, had already started the rumor mill. I saw her in her garden the next morning, and she waved at me with a knowing smile that made my blood run cold. She didn't have to say anything. The message was clear. The world was closing in, and I had nowhere left to hide.
A week passed. A week of silence, of guilt, of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, it did. Daniel came home. I was in the living room, staring blankly at the television, when I heard the front door open. I froze, my heart seizing in my chest. He wasn't supposed to be back for another 3 weeks. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked towards the foyer. And there he was, standing in the entryway, his suitcase at his feet. He looked tired, haggard, but it was his eyes that stopped me cold. They were flat, dead, the eyes of a man who had been told a terrible truth and had been forced to accept it. "Daniel," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. "You're back early." "I got a call," he said, devoid of emotion. "From Sarah." He paused, letting the name hang in the air between us, a guillotine blade waiting to fall. "She said she saw you at the fall festival, with your cousin from California." The color drained from my face. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer another pathetic lie, but no words came out. The truth was a rock lodged in my throat, impossible to swallow and impossible to speak. "She didn't believe it," he continued, his voice flat and distant. "She said you looked like you were on a date. She said the way he touched you was not how cousins touch. She said, a lot of things, Ella." He finally looked at me, his eyes searching my face for something he used to find there. "So I hired someone, a private investigator."
Before I even came home, I wanted to know. I needed to know. The room started to spin. I gripped the edge of the foyer table, my knuckles white. "Daniel, don't," he said, holding up a hand. "Don't lie to me again. I know everything. I know about the coffee shop. I know about the studio. I know about the nights you told me you were at the gym or with friends. I have photos, Ella. I have texts. I have everything. You've been having an affair for months." The tears started to stream down my face, hot and shameful. I sank to my knees on the hardwood floor, the cold seeping through my leggings. The facade was gone. The beautiful, perfect life was shattered, and it was all my fault. My selfishness, my loneliness, my desperate need for validation. It had all come crashing down in the most spectacular, humiliating way possible. "Who is he?" Daniel asked, his voice a low, controlled growl. "Who the hell is he?" "His name is Leo," I whispered, the words tasting like poison. "He's an artist. He's nobody." "He's nobody," Daniel repeated, and a bitter, broken laugh escaped his lips. "You destroyed our marriage for a nobody. You threw away everything we built for a nobody. Do you have any idea how pathetic that is, Ella? How utterly pathetic?" I couldn't answer, because he was right. I had thrown away everything for a fantasy, a beautiful, intoxicating fantasy that had always been destined to combust. I had been so desperate to feel something real that I had burned down my entire life. Daniel walked past me, heading towards the bedroom. I heard him open the closet, heard the sound of drawers opening and closing. I stayed on the floor, unable to move, unable to do anything but listen to him pack. He came back a few minutes later, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He stood over me, looking down at the wreckage of his wife. "Your cousin, Leo," he said, the words dripping with contempt. "I'm going to stay at a hotel. I've already called my lawyer. We'll be in touch about the divorce." "Daniel, please," I begged, reaching out to grab his leg. "Please, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I was so lonely. I was so invisible. I needed to feel seen. He stepped back, pulling away from my touch. You needed to feel seen, he repeated, his voice breaking for the first time. I gave you everything. I gave you this house, this life, my name. I gave you everything I had, and it wasn't enough. It was never enough. He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I had married, the man who used to look at me like I was the most important thing in the world. Then it was gone, replaced by a cold, hard indifference that was somehow worse than anger. You didn't need to feel seen, Ella. You needed to feel wanted. You needed to be the center of someone's universe, and you didn't care who you destroyed to get it.
He walked out the door, and the sound of it closing behind him was the most final, devastating sound I had ever heard. I stayed on the floor for hours, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Gus came over and licked my face, his tail wagging gently, his unconditional love a stark contrast to the wreckage of my life. The night was long and dark. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, replaying every moment, every choice, every lie. I thought about Leo and the love I thought I felt. I thought about Daniel and the trust I had shattered. I thought about the woman I used to be, the woman with integrity and kindness, the woman who believed in loyalty. She was a ghost now, a distant memory I didn't recognize. In the morning, I finally looked at my phone. There were dozens of texts from Leo. Ella, please talk to me. I heard about your husband. Are you okay? I'm sorry I pushed you. Please call me. I scrolled through them, my heart a cold, dead thing in my chest. And I realized something, a terrible, devastating truth. I didn't miss him. I missed the feeling of being desired. I missed the escape he provided from my empty life. But the man himself, the real man with his own flaws and complexities and expectations, I didn't know him. I had never truly known him. I had used him as a mirror to reflect back the woman I wanted to be, and he had played his part beautifully. But it was all a fantasy.
A beautiful, soul-crushing fantasy. I deleted his texts, I blocked his number, and I sat in the silence of my empty townhouse, surrounded by the echoes of my own betrayal. The door had locked behind us, and then we heard a noise. That noise was the truth, and once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The truth was that I was alone, completely, utterly alone, and I had no one to blame but myself. The fantasy was over. The fall had come, and now I had to figure out how to stand up again, in the ruins of the life I had so carelessly destroyed. I had to learn to see myself, not through the adoring eyes of a lover or the comfortable neglect of a husband, but through my own eyes. And that, I knew, was going to be the hardest part of all.